Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Hamburg. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. It's definitely a real honor. So this is going to be quite an experimental talk. Hopefully you can see my screen. So what I wanted to do was to conceptualize modern science using ideas from The Game of Nations, which is a book from the 60s about power politics. So why I wanted to do this in particular was to explore themes in modern science, particularly adversarial and collaborative themes, and then also the interplay between competition, collaboration, and ethical concerns in scientific advancement. So I'm going to outline how I think DeSci could help build towards a more peaceful, prosperous, and safe future for science. Really, this talk is a thought experiment about DeSci, which I just wanted to share with you all. So these are some of the key themes which I've taken from power politics, as I mentioned, and I've applied them to modern science. Sorry, the writing is a little bit small. Hopefully you can see it on the recording, but I'm going to go through each of them anyway, and I can also make my slides available as well. Also, please note, this by no means applies to all of science. I think it's really important that we don't think of current science as bad or wrong. It's just personally, I feel that highlighting and thinking through these problems in science, no matter how rare or systemic they are, can help improve modern science and in turn the world. So the first column here is resource competition. I think any scientists in the room may be familiar with this. Anyone who has any friends or family who are scientists, there's a lot of competition for resources in science. So just as nations compete, scientific institutions and researchers compete for funding and other resources as well. So maybe talent. Definitely competition can be really healthy. It can definitely drive innovation, but it can also, on the flip side of that, create secrecy and silos. We definitely see a lot of silos in academia, and possibly attempts to undermine rivals. Next here we have alliances and collaborations. So similar to political alliances, you definitely do get strategic scientific collaborations. I think the Human Genome Project is a good example of this. There's also various brain mapping projects that go on. And these are generally formed to help pool resources, so grants, often consortiums apply for large grants, also talent as well, skills, knowledge. So scientific alliances can definitely accelerate progress, but they are also often influenced by the strategic influences of those involved, and also players outside of alliances might be disproportionately disadvantaged by not being in alliance like the other scientists or institutions are. Public opinion, so just like nations engaging in propaganda and public relations, scientific research is sometimes used in PR campaigns, or scientists themselves may, institutions may enlist, PR teams. So PR campaigns can lead to disinformation. Also, the exaggeration of scientific achievements is something you sometimes see. And I guess quite topical at the moment, maybe downplaying of limitations and risks. I think possibly we're seeing this with some of the PR around AI companies. And then last but not least, we have ethical and moral considerations. So just like these are important for power politics and nation states, when thinking about science, in the pursuit of scientific advancements, researchers might overlook moral considerations or even maybe engage in unethical practices, things like IP theft, or actions that could be harmful to society or the environment, maybe now or potentially in the future. An example of this is the CRISPR embryo editing experiment from 2018. Sneak peek at the next slide there. So what I've done next is continuing on from the framework of power politics applied to science, which is what I was just going through. Here I've outlined peacemaking processes that could be applied to modern science to help tackle the issues that I mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to go through these in turn. So an important aspect of peacemaking is open communication and transparency. When you think of this in terms of science, what does that mean? It might look like supporting open access, supporting open data sharing across institutions. Also, peacemaking is about building collaborative frameworks and partnerships, often cross borders. When you think about this applied to science, maybe that looks like research consortiums. And also important is developing ethical guidelines and regulations. So maybe when thinking about science, this could be ensuring responsible research practices. Conflict resolution techniques, I think that's something when people think about peacemaking, a lot of it is around conflict resolution. How do you handle disagreements? When applied for science, this could be around addressing ethical concerns, maybe addressing the balance of like innovation and ethics. Again, kind of what we're seeing playing out now with OpenAI and the open letters from thought leaders in the space. You know, how do you actually implement resolution techniques when there's so many different actors and stakeholders who have different agendas? And then finally, fostering a culture of responsibility and not finally, sorry, there's a point I just can't see underneath my laptop. So next up is fostering a culture of responsibility and cooperation. So this could be through things like education, workshops, and training in science. And then finally, last but not least, I think this one's really interesting. With peacekeeping, it's important to encourage cooperation, as I said, cross-border, but also international cooperation is quite interesting. And when you think about this applied to science, you're thinking more about those global challenges. And a good example of this could be space exploration, something like that. So those are the peacemaking processes which you could potentially apply to science. So you may be wondering, how does DeSci come in? Well, I believe that DeSci could maybe help address some of the issues related to competition, collaboration, and ethical concerns that are such key factors in the game of modern science through processes that are essentially peacekeeping. So maybe just to kind of summarize the last slide, for me, it seemed to be like peacemaking is all about open and transparent cooperation within a culture of shared values. To me, that sounds very much like DeSci, so I'll go on to explain a bit more about that. So in particular, here are some of the key aspects of DeSci, which I think might help contribute towards this. So first up, we have data sharing and transparency. So within DeSci, the idea is that data is accessible, it's tamper-proof, it's traceable, and in turn, this could help foster an environment of open communication and collaboration, which, as mentioned earlier, is so important. Also, intellectual property protection. So the protection and tracking of provenance and ideas through blockchain could help researchers feel more comfortable sharing their work, openly discussing their work, knowing that their contributions are acknowledged and protected. Next up, incentives. So this is often what's focused on with DeSci. I mean, it's definitely something which is important. So the idea that you can have decentralized and transparent funding, which could promote healthy competition for resources, and also incentivize behaviors such as collaboration and data sharing. And I guess that would be through different kinds of tokens, maybe like NFTs. I think what's also interesting, and we definitely see a lot of this already in the space, is it enables groups of people to easily form shared treasuries and receive and manage funding together, you know, and this might then lead to maybe globally distributed labs, which are outside of traditional silos, which is something which has historically been obviously very difficult, in part due to like, I guess, traditional banking structures and things like that. But when we're talking about maybe digital currencies, pooling resources in shared wallets rather than business bank accounts, definitely some of those borders come down a little bit. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about decentralized verifiable reputation systems. So this could provide a transparent reputation record, which I think could help encourage responsible research practices and also maybe help discourage irresponsible practices. At the moment, I think it's quite difficult if someone puts out a paper, which is later sort of have people talking about maybe there's problems with the paper, etc. It doesn't necessarily negatively impact like your H index, for example. So I think being able to balance reputation systems with encouraging responsible but also discouraging irresponsible practices is something which I think would really help with science. And then methods for reaching consensus among large and diverse groups, definitely something which Web3 helps in terms of, you know, governance tokens, new methods for voting, quadratic voting, all those kinds of mechanisms which we're kind of seeing being used already. So I think this idea of different ways of reaching consensus among large groups of people can definitely help promote cross-border collaboration, which I was speaking about earlier is very important with peacemaking. And that includes sort of groups who maybe have been traditionally excluded from decision-making, traditionally excluded from science, sort of women and minority groups. And I think it could also help facilitate global research partnerships and, maybe new partnerships like I was discussing earlier about maybe these globally distributed labs. And also help diverse groups achieve alignment, for example, on moral issues, maybe what we're thinking about at the moment with AI and distributed AI, decentralized AI, maybe having consensus mechanisms like this for large groups of people to voice their opinion and vote could actually be something which is really positive for the future of science. Which does bring me on to my next slide, future-proofing science. Yes, I did create this artwork, if anyone's wondering, with the help of DALL-E. The little prompt is there. It is a futurist painting of a DNA double helix and computer code. Anyway, so yes, as I was saying, in addition to helping combat problems in modern science, which is what I've been talking about, I do believe that DeSci can also help future-proof science. Definitely modern science needs huge amounts of collaboration between countries, also disciplines, and now AI as well, which is super interesting because if you think about it, a lot of the solutions people are building, the users are going to be AI. AI might be sort of like the last interface is what people are saying. So it's interesting to think about who's going to be reading a paper. Is it a person? Is it AI, an AI assistant, etc.? So I think definitely when we're thinking of collaboration, it's no longer just human to human. It's definitely like human with AI in that collaborative loop. And then interestingly, when you combine AI with Web3, you might get improvements in transparency, definitely something which is criticized at the moment in terms of AI. Also data security and the potential for enhanced privacy through decentralized privacy preserving tools. In theory, you can also shift the concentration of power away from the AI puts power in the hands of the elite few, and it's the idea you could shift that to open and democratically governed communities instead. I also believe that DeSci can help empower researchers to have healthy relationships with industry and investors. For example, through protecting and tracking the provenance of data and ideas, which I mentioned earlier. Also the potential for fractionalization and return of value right the way back to those sort of original bench researchers, which, later research tends to stand on the shoulders of and extracts profits from without returning it to the original basic science research. I do think that these relationships will be ever more valuable for researchers as deep tech becomes increasingly important. And by that, I mean the convergence of different technologies coming together. And deep tech requires many different stakeholders, many different alignment between many different stakeholders, and also is famously very resource intensive. So this point I think is particularly salient for future-proofing science. And then finally, I just wanted to say that, there's sometimes this spillover from the innovation mantra of move fast and break things into science. I would just want to say for me, that's not what science is about. And therefore, decentralized science is about. So I believe that DeSci is a tool whereby we can actually harness technology to help us instead collaborate and find the truth. So for me, that mantra makes more sense, especially when we're talking about, peacekeeping and safety in science. So that brings me on to some examples that I wanted to talk about. So I've chosen to highlight a few DeSci projects which I think promote the principles I've discussed in this talk. Sorry, I know the slides are really boring, I know. So these are just a few projects. There are many, many more. Also, this isn't exactly an endorsement of these particular projects. I just think that they suit very well what I'm talking about here in terms of the principles. And some projects which I haven't put on here would also sit across a few of these different categories. An example is algovera.ai. And they provide grants, and they also help foster collaborative and transparent AI communities and solutions. Also bio.xyz, who are a DeSci accelerator powered by Molecule, and they'd sit across many of these themes as well. So I'm just going to go through these. So in terms of resources, obviously there's Gitcoin. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, quadratic funding for public goods. I also wanted to highlight In Theory. So this is a crowdsourced science funding platform that lets any user support research by collecting project-inspired generative artworks. It's especially geared towards early career researchers and DAOs, enabling them to gain community exposure and funding for their work. And then also Science Fund. So they are reimagining how discovery is funded. There's no grant applications with this solution. Instead, rapid funding cycles support more ideas early, and then they continue funding what's working. Also, transparent and traceable funding records with an impact focus revolutionize the donor experience. Under data sharing and transparency, I really wanted to highlight the work of DeSci nodes by DeSci Labs. So nodes are published on an open access repository. The idea is that work is fair, so that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And also your node is yours. So you're free to publish your work anywhere else that's relevant for you. So I thought that was particularly a good example of a particularly good sharing and transparency solution that's being built. Next up, collaboration. I really wanted to highlight the work of the interdisciplinary communities here, like DeSci Japan, DeSci Africa. I think these are really exciting communities who are bringing together people in different regions of different disciplines. And I think almost in a way, these will become, they're almost like seeds of maybe global universities, future universities. I think it's really cool what these groups are doing. Also, DeSci World, they're a really good example of, they're working at the moment on a cross-organization ethical guidelines, which is similar to what I was talking about earlier. And then in terms of international collaborations, I wanted to highlight Space BioDAO here. What I was speaking about earlier about global collaborations on global issues, I think Space BioDAO could be a really good sort of tool, vehicle for that kind of work in science. And then last but not least, definitely reputation. So Holonym is a system for seamless portable login and producing proofs of your source data, even without revealing it. And this makes it really useful for transforming credentials and impact into sort of digital reputation, and then using that reputation within protocols, for example, with voting, maybe even perhaps providing reviews for work in your field, and maybe even, retroactive funding for your work. And it also can be anonymous as well. So again, those are just a few projects that I wanted to highlight in the space. And now on to the last slide. So I was thinking to promote more of the kind of culture and behaviors in science that I've spoken about here. I thought it might be good to create an annual DeSci Peace Prize. I've not ironed out the details, but I'm just thinking it would entail maybe awarding an NFT badge each year to a DeSci project, which the community thinks might help promote peace, prosperity, and safety in science. If you're interested, definitely keep an eye on my Twitter account for more information. So that's everything. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. I'd absolutely love to hear feedback from anybody about the framework, whether you think it's useful for DeSci or not, and of course, how it could be improved. So thank you so much again for inviting me to speak, and I hope you enjoy the conference, the event.